Well, thanks everyone for coming out, for such a good turnout again for Kate. Ben loves its Klondike Kate, so that's always nice to see. So again, my name's Nate Pedersen. I'm a librarian with Deschutes Public Library. I'm based out of the downtown branch, and I'm on the board of directors over at the museum. So let's start by just verifying that everyone in the back can hear me okay. We don't have a microphone, so are you all doing okay in the far back there? Can you hear me? Okay. So tonight we're here to learn about Klondike Kate. Thank you for coming out despite the lack of beer. This started off as a history pub presentation, which I'm sure some of you have been at previously, and that of course is hosted by McMenamins and has the great advantage of letting you purchase alcohol while you listen to people talk about history. So that's on the last Tuesday of every month. This was the January program for that, and we've done it a couple times since then. So again, thanks for coming out to learn about one of our local celebrity is Klondike Kate, who had many names. She was the queen of the Yukon, the belle of Dawson City, the golden girl of the North, the flower of the North, the Klondike queen. And as a woman that had many names, she also wore many faces throughout her life, lived many lives in one life. That's what we'll be talking about tonight. She was a tomboy and a dancer and a singer and a trial witness and a poet and a philanthropist and a divorcee and a widow. And really Kate's life at the end of the day is a classic study of the American possibility of reinvention, which is, I think, is something we hold near and dear in America. So Kate ruled the North for a brief period of time, and later on in life she homesteaded here in Central Oregon, as some of you I'm sure are aware of, and she spent years conducting charitable deeds right here in our backyard here in Bend, Oregon. She married 4 times in her life and turned down countless marriage proposals. She traveled all over North America, and her life was rich with drama, constantly changing on a dime, from rags to riches, to rags again, to riches again, to rags again, and so on. So happiness, sorrow, danger, fun, despair, tears, these are all aspects of Kate's life that we'll talk about tonight. So I've divided up her life into various stages, and we'll start with Klondike Kate, the tomboy. So Kathleen Aloysia Rockwell, which was her full name, was born on October 4th of 1876. So she was a centennial baby. She was born in Junction City, Kansas, and shortly after she was born, they moved to the town photographed here, Oswego, Kansas. She was described as a bouncing, red-haired, and blue-eyed girl. And her mother, Martha, was a waitress, and her father, John, was a railroad man and a telegraph operator, and for both of them, it was their second marriage, and then they had Kate, and when she was only 2 months old, they left Junction City for the place seen here in the slide, and that's where her mother, Martha, ran the local depot, the local train depot restaurant. In November of 1881, when Kate was 5 years old, her mother divorced her father, so that would be divorce number 2 for her mother. And she got on with a prominent local Oswego attorney named Francis Betts. And this fellow was the divorce lawyer, and I don't know if this is something that happens a lot, but in this case, Martha fell in love with her divorce lawyer. And she and this fellow named Bettis fell in love. He was quite the catch for Martha at that point in her life because he was well-to-do. He had built quite a name for himself in Kansas. He was distinguished. He was one of the most powerful lawyers at the turn of the century in Kansas. And Kate was deeply influenced by this man that would become her stepfather. And he would influence her through his outspoken and blunt personality. And he was always something of a showman, which is something that Kate took to heart and later fully developed, as we'll see. So after a year in Kansas, the trio packed their bags and left for the West. Francis Bettis opened up a law firm in Spokane Falls, Washington, now called Spokane. But that's a photograph of Spokane Falls in the 1890s, around the same time that the trio would have arrived there. They lived in a grand Victorian house on Northeast 3rd Street, and that's where Kate grew up. That's where she spent her formative years. And her stepfather kind of immersed himself into local politics. He quickly became a relatively colorful personality of the Pacific Northwest and was elected to the judgeship of the local circuit court. And Kate, as a result, grew up in style. In Spokane, they had a variety of household servants and were considered prominent citizens of the town. And Kate developed a taste for the finer things in life, which would always haunt her and follow her around wherever she went. But in addition to enjoying those finer things in life, Kate was always by nature a rebel. And she was constantly playing hooky from school here in Spokane. Whenever she could, she was always described as dancing or running when she could have just been walking somewhere. And people described her as a merry child, as someone who was vivacious and full of life. And by equal measures, charming and frustrating to her parents, as you can imagine. She later said about this time in her life, "It wasn't that I was bad, I was just imaginative and full of life and of the excitement of living," which is a good quote. And two events exemplify her character that took place in Spokane. This kind of represents her personality. She would often gather together a variety of friends from school and convince all of them to play hooky simultaneously. They'd ditch school, they'd head down to the river and have a picnic, and how they acquired the goods for that picnic, how they got their food and drink was by using her father's credit at the local store. So she charged the whole hooky expedition to the local judge's credit account at the local general store, and that's how she funded those. And another event that also exemplifies her character, when she was 8 years old, there was a bad fire in Spokane and a lot of people were homeless for a while. And Kate went around town and invited all of these newly homeless folks to come just stay at her place. She's like, "We've got this huge Victorian house, come stay at our place." And so for 2 weeks, the mansion there in Spokane was full of cots on every possible corner, and a variety of people that were displaced by that fire stayed there, because if you're the local judge, you can't really say no at that point, can you? After your daughter's invited all these people to come stay there. So those events kind of exemplify Kate's young character and the same character that she would exhibit later on in life too. So Kate was, as you can probably already imagine, she was constantly flouting conventions and constantly flouting the attempts of her parents to turn her into a high society girl. That's what they were hoping to groom her for. So what do when you're relatively wealthy in that era and you have a rebellious young girl? You send her off to private school. You find some Catholic schools around the country that she can go to. So Kate spent 12 years bouncing between various seminary schools, much of that time at St. Joseph's in Minnesota and St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the image on the left in that slide, and then as well as the Snell Seminary for young ladies. I don't know if that was what's going on with my psychology there, but on the right-hand side you'll see the Snell Seminary for young ladies in Oakland, California. And after 12 years bouncing around and getting kicked out of every seminary school she was sent to, Kate returned to Spokane looking something like this. This enters into the next phase of her life, which I'm calling the perpetual fiancé. She came back with auburn hair and violet eyes and a shapely figure. And she'd grown up in ways that were not unnoticed to the local men of Spokane. And she became quickly the talk of town. She was always a bit of a shameless flirter. And she made her way around town. She'd sneak off whenever possible to country dances and that kind of thing. And this was a very happy time period in Kate's life. And it came to an abrupt end when her mother divorced her stepfather, this local judge, after a stock market crash put an undue amount of economic strain on the relationship, and the relationship couldn't quite survive that. The money had been wiped out. And so the mother and daughter were sent packing, and Kate never saw her stepfather again. She never saw the judge again in her life. After that stock market crash, he moved to California and made a new life for himself there, and Kate always described herself as missing him terribly, but for whatever reason they never connected again. So Kate and her mother briefly operated a boarding house in Spokane to make ends meet, which was quite a come down for former members of the upper crust of the local community. And when the family home on that Northeast 3rd Street, that's the mansion I've referred to a few times, that was eventually sold to pay off the debts from the financial crash. And Kate and Martha suddenly found that they had $65,000 to their name, which is quite a bit of money. So by today's cash, that's about $1.7 million that they suddenly had inherited. So they're like, all right, we're out of here. We're done with this. And they decided they'd use this as an excuse to visit Kate's stepbrother, so a child from Martha's first marriage, who was living at that point in time in Valparaiso, Chile. So they boarded a clipper bound for South America. Here's a photograph of Valparaiso, Chile, around the time that Kate would have arrived there. She loved everything about this. She loved the journey south. When they arrived in the harbor, she had become engaged for the first of many times in her life. At 15 years old, she was engaged to the ship's first mate and probably didn't fully understand exactly what that meant. She really had no intention of actually marrying the fellow. And her mother was not particularly amused by this turn of events, so she sent Kate, or Kitty as her affectionate pet name was, she sent Kitty off to a convent school, the Convent of the Sacred Heart, here in Valparaiso, Chile, where Kate taught kindergarten and was under strict instruction not to leave without a chaperone. But as you can imagine, that was just an obstacle to overcome at the first possible opportunity. And Martha left her kid there. She ditched Kate there for a while and took off. This is a bit of speculation at this point, but we think she took off after a love interest in England and boarded a ship bound for London and left Kate here in Chile. And Kate had the time of her life. So she had a natural inclination toward the romantic feeling of the Chilean people. She loved the music and the gaiety and the dancing that took place all the time. And so she constantly made a game out of slipping her chaperone at the first possible opportunity and spent her nights out with the boys of the town. And she started a little collection of engagement rings. She eventually accepted seven different proposals while she was in Chile, and she kept all these diamond rings in a desk drawer in her room at the convent. And eventually the sisters in her room shack discovered the rings sitting there and demanded that she gave them all back to their respective owners, which was a great disappointment to Kate at 15 years old, who thought she should be able to keep all of her hard-earned diamond rings. And Kate also, while she was in Chile, she learned how to roll her own cigarettes, which was a trait that was endlessly commented on about Kate in future press accounts of her. She always made something of a show of it. Whenever she was being interviewed by a newspaper, she'd, without fail, at some point in the interview would roll her own cigarette. And inevitably that would make its way into the press account. That was considered quite the thing to do for a lady in that era. So Martha, her mother, eventually returns after her jaunt in England, and she, instead of going back to Chile, she goes to New York City, and she hears about all the trouble that Kate's been up to down in South America, so she writes to the sisters of the convent and demands that her daughter be sent on to her in New York. So now we move into the New York chapter of their lives. So Kate arrived shortly after that in New York City, which looked a little bit like this, teeming with life around the turn of the century. And she was greeted by her mother, who had the sad news to report that they were actually pretty much broke. So after a scant couple of years, that 1.7 million by our money today was gone. And so they had to figure out the next thing to do. They found a cheap apartment in New York City. Martha, her mother, took a job at a shirt factory in New York City for $4 a week. And Kate had to figure out what to do. She started pouring through the classifieds looking for a job. And eventually she saw a small ad that said, "Chorus girls wanted, no experience necessary." And that ad changed Kate's life forever. She soon joined a Coney Island theater, first as a page girl, then as a regular member of the chorus. And as you can kind of imagine, Kate was a natural. She was born for this. This is an illustration of what Coney Island was like around the turn of the century. She was paid $18 a week, so it's quite a bit more than her mother was making to serve on this local theater company as a chorus girl, and she just loved it. She loved the romance and the magic and the hysteria of the stage and the crowds of people. Coney Island at that point in time was filled with thousands of visitors every day. So you can imagine the noise and the energy, which I think is captured pretty well in that illustration there. It was full of a wide range of folks. There was money barons at the time and European royalty that would visit Coney Island. And then on the other side, you'd have con men and criminals that frequented the area, as well as just your average middle-class vacationers. So it was this gaudy carnival by day and by night, a sort of gaslit enchantment. And it was a beautiful summer for Kate. And then, as summers do, summer ended eventually. And her theater closed down and boarded up. And she was out of a job, and she grew restless again. This is what she looked like around that time. And so she decided to go back west. She returned to Spokane Falls on the promise of a vaudeville job from a chorus girl friend. And so she moved out west again. She worked for a vaudeville show. It was a place with a saloon and a stage in it, so she would serve drinks in between doing dancing and singing acts. And she didn't like the job very much at all, but she traveled across the country to take it, and she needed to pay off the debt she'd incurred through that trip. And eventually she hoped to pay for her mother to join her in Spokane, and eventually she did. Eventually she saved enough money as a vaudeville dancer in Spokane for Martha to leave New York City and make her way over to Spokane. But of course, as mothers are, as soon as the mother arrived in Spokane, she said, "What are you doing dancing here in a town where we're formerly respectable members of the local community?" So she told Kate to quit her job as a vaudeville dancer and try to find something more respectable to do, which Kate struggled with a little bit. And so Kate left Spokane to wander around the Pacific Northwest for a time. And she was looking for better work, but something that also pertained or related to her skills, her natural skills as a dancer and a singer. And she eventually surfaced here. This is Seattle around that time period. And she took a job for a few weeks at a place called the People's Theater. And then she again sent for her mother, trying to get her mother settled into Seattle. And Seattle at the time is full of energy and excitement, and it's fully gripped by the Gold Rush fever, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But news had just recently arrived in Seattle of a great gold strike in the Klondike and the Yukon, and people were preparing from Seattle to depart for the far north in droves. So the mayor of Seattle famously, along with half of the police force, quit their jobs abruptly once news of the Klondike Gold Rush hit Seattle and went up north to try to strike it rich. So Kate, meanwhile, got hired by a place that you can see here in the middle building there called the Savoy Theater, which actually is over in Victoria, British Columbia, so not too far from Seattle, but it was considered to be a first-class vaudeville house, so a bit of a step up from the places she'd been working in. At this point in time, she became engaged again, this time to a minstrel star, a fellow named Danny Allman, who was 31 at the time and a star in New York. And Kate was 19 years old and a vaudeville star here in British Columbia. And he had these plans to travel across the country to join her. But something else was increasingly on Kate's mind, and that was the gold rush going on in the far north. She was excited by this fever that had gripped a lot of people in that era, a lot of people especially on the west coast here. And Kate felt like she was perhaps missing a party, and she was never one to miss a party. And so she began to think this gold rush might provide an opportunity to solve any future financial troubles for herself and her mother, and would be an incredible adventure to boot. So we're going to enter into the next phase of Kate's life here, which we're calling the Queen of the Yukon. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background information now on the Klondike Gold Rush to set the scene a bit. In August of 1896, the fellow on the left there, an American prospector named George Carmack, accompanied by his Tagish, which is one of the native tribes of that area, his Tagish wife there on the upper right, Kate, and her brother named Skookum Jim, the fellow in the bottom right, which I think is kind of an awesome nickname, Skookum Jim. But they were looking for gold on a place called Rabbit Creek, which is a tributary of the Klondike River up in the Yukon Territory. And it's not clear who of these three people actually discovered the gold in the first place, but the group rather intelligently agreed to let George, the one white guy in the mix, go in and claim to be the official discoverer, because the mining authorities at that point in time would not have recognized a claim made by a native. And so they had George file the claim, and he measured out 4 claims, strips of ground that could later be legally mined by himself along the river. He earned 2 technically. As the discoverer, you got your 1 claim as well as 1 additional claim because you found the strike. And then he took 2 more, 1 for his wife and 1 for his brother-in-law. And then the claims are registered at the police post at the mouth of the 40-mile river, and then news spread extremely fast from there to the other mining camps in the Yukon River Valley, and by the end of that month, by the end of August 1896, all of what was formerly called Rabbit Creek but was now called Bonanza Creek had been claimed by miners, and tributaries of the Bonanza Creek were still up for grabs, and claims already were sold at vast sums between miners and speculators, and the outside world still was entirely unaware of the news of this strike. The winter that was on its way prevented river traffic from leaving the Klondike, and it wasn't until June of 1897, so almost a full year after the initial discovery of gold, that the first boats finally left the Klondike and carrying both gold and the news of the discovery, which struck big. Here's a headline from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer: latest news from the Klondike 9 o'clock edition, gold, 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 gold. So when news struck, it struck big, and it launched what we've started to call now the Klondike Stampede, which began that next month in July of 1897. And that's when the first of the early prospectors returned from the Klondike, and they had with them huge amounts of gold. The press at that time reported that the first boat arrived with $1.139 million in gold, which is the equivalent of $1 billion today in gold on one boat. And here's the real kicker about that figure: they underestimated it. They were wrong. They had lowballed it. There was more money than that on that single ship. So that news, as you can imagine, effectively launched the Klondike Stampede, which was an attempt by about 100,000 people from all parts of America, but mostly from the West Coast, from all these folks to try to reach the Klondike gold fields. Of the 100,000 some people that set out, about 30,000 people actually made it there in the end. And that included our very own Klondike Kate. So all that ferment about the gold's happening in the background while she's dancing at the Savoy Theatre in Victoria, British Columbia. And eventually Kate couldn't resist the temptation any longer to join in the stampede. So armed with a good friend and a few extra dollars in her pocket, she boarded a ship bound for the Yukon. And her friend turned back at Skagway, but Kate continued on. And she stayed at each respective town along the route, which is it's a long ways to go, especially in that era. And she stayed at each town for a little while, and she'd earn a little bit of money, doing a little bit of dancing on the side, participating in vaudeville to some extent. And eventually she worked in a place called Whitehorse in the dance halls, which were really just tents. They're just sort of tents with a raised platform at one end. It's a little bit seedy, and she kind of hated it there. She thought of it as kind of a dingy, seedy place to be dancing, but she was trying to just earn that last bit of cash, that last bit of capital that would help her push through for that final bit to get up to the Klondike. But while she was in Whitehorse, a letter arrived to her from Victoria, the place where she'd been dancing at the Savoy Theatre, and they had asked her to come back down to British Columbia and rejoin the newly dubbed Savoy Theatrical Company as a soubrette. And the company planned to descend upon Dawson. Dawson's kind of the main town in the Klondike. That whole company from British Columbia planned to descend en masse on Dawson the next year. So even though she was pretty close at that point to Dawson, she turned back and thought it'd be better to do it when she could be paid well, to be part of a large theater company and arrive in style. So she retreated. She got back to British Columbia. She joined the Savoy Theatre, which had 173 members, and they were going to become the largest troupe ever to descend into the Klondike. This troupe consisted of dancers and actors and singers, comedians, prop men, makeup men, wardrobe men, custodians, seamstresses, directors, stagehands, and a whole orchestra of ragtime musicians. That's how you filled up 173 spots, which is a huge troupe. And they got on the first riverboat that eventually arrived in Dawson in the heart of the Klondike in the spring of 1900. Dawson at 1900 was looking at a population of about 30,000, which is up from 500 people the previous year. So an enormous increase in the amount of people there. The Savoy Theatrical Company had purchased a theater in advance, and the photo's a bit blurry, but it's the only one that survives. That's the photo of the actual Savoy Theater in Dawson. And this is where they advertise themselves, I'll quote here, as a refined and moral entertainment consisting of amazing and edifying offerings in thrilling scenes from our astounding repertoire, interpreted by matchless artists of our internationally acclaimed company, thrills and fun for all, elevating and entertaining. So I always kind of like how 19th century advertisements are so full of boastful praise about themselves. I think that kind of nails it. So Kate herself was billed as the soubrette extraordinaire. That was her title with the Savoy Theatre, and she took to the stage singing and dancing. She did the French can-can. She sang tearful ballads, which were all the rage in the late Victorian era. People liked to feel sentimental, and Kate provided them that feeling. A soubrette's typically a young soprano singer, which is what Kate was, and their voice is usually described as youthful and energetic and loud, and she was good at that. She was good at being loud, and they're given supporting roles in plays as maids and that kind of thing. And the miners quickly went wild for Kate, and Kate mingled with the crowd afterwards and was quickly making $50 a week plus tips. $50 a week is about $1,400 a week by our modern standards. And it's hard to really imagine this anymore, but these miners had a lot of money, they had a lot of gold, and they had nothing to spend it on. And here they are in this little town called Dawson, and there's these beautiful women dancing on the stage. So what do you do when you're loaded down with extra gold dust and these beautiful women are dancing in front of you? You just start throwing it up there on the stage. So that's how these women in the Klondike made fortunes. They made huge amounts of money off of this. And Kate also made money on top of that from drinking with the miners after she would perform her show. So basically you could book yourself a accompaniment for the evening, and how far that went depended on who you'd booked. But at the very least, that person would then drink wine with you, and they'd be making a commission on each bottle of wine that you purchased as a miner. So Kate famously on her first night made $500 off of a miner who ordered, I kind of love this, he ordered over 100 bottles of wine. But it's noted that he only drank 8, right? So he drank 8 bottles of wine, which is a lot to drink. But he ordered 100 throughout the night, and Kate made, in her first night in the Yukon, she made $14,000 by today's standard. And eventually, her highest reported earnings ever were $750 a night, which is about $21,000 by today's money. So Kate was a huge attraction. This is what she looked like at the time. She was a huge attraction to the local miners. They loved her for her looks, of course, but also for her ability to listen to them. She was always recorded as being an extremely good listener. People felt really comfortable talking to her, and they talked to her about their troubles and about their problems, and that's why they'd stay and order 100 bottles of wine in a single night. So, the thing to remember too is these are lonely men, and there's not very many women up here, and they're desperate for female companionship of any kind, and they're very generous with their gold. The miners that participated in the Klondike Gold Rush held that as a high virtue. They thought it was a terrible thing to be miserly with your earnings. People were respected if they were gregarious, if they were generous in character, and that's something that Kate always was and always responded to. She was by nature exactly like that. She fit right in, and they loved her. There's several stories about her talking miners out of suicide, out of committing suicide, turning around the lives of some down on their luck miners, and helping them even with giving them money to kind of start over again if they lost everything. So on top of all that, she soon developed her signature dance, which was called the flame dance, which at one point she could elevate in the air hundreds of yards of red chiffon behind her while she was dancing. So you can imagine, especially pre-television, pre any of these sort of modern entertainments, hundreds of yards of red chiffon in the air at one point in time must have been quite a marvelous sight. And Kate was very good at that. That was a signature act, not only of her repertoire, but it became the signature act of that theater that we showed previously, of the Savoy Theatre. And her pay went up to $200 a week, which is just her baseline salary, of course, and that's about $5,500 by today's money per week. A review of her dance, I'll quote from this because, again, I love this 19th century language. A bit of thistledown blowing on a summer zephyr, a poem of loveliness, an Elysian symphony of matchless contour and bewitching beauty with dimpled shoulders and snow-white arms. So that was a description of Kate dancing. And perhaps needless to say, she received about 100 proposals for marriage in her first month in the Yukon. And on Christmas Eve of her first year there, she was formally dubbed the Queen of the Yukon, and she did an elaborate dance while wearing a headdress lit with 50 candles, if you can imagine that. Then one night her eyes alighted on the fellow seen on the right there, a young server at that Savoy Theater, a fellow named Alexander Pantages. Alexander at the time was a young guy. He was in his mid-20s. He was a Greek immigrant, and he'd bandied about the New World for some time in this sort of endless quest to make a fortune. He was always driven by money, by the acquisition of money, and as would make sense with someone with that kind of personality, he was attracted to Dawson and to the Klondike Gold Rush, which gave him the opportunity to make plenty of money. A good little story about Alexander and his first night in the Yukon. He got off the boat, and everyone was pretty desperate for news, because news travels really slow at that point in time. Everyone's waiting for the next boat to come in with a newspaper from New York or San Francisco. And he immediately realizes that all these folks waiting on the shore are waiting for some news. And he has this newspaper with him, and a guy calls out and says, "Hey, I see you've got a newspaper, I'll give you $5 for that." And that clicks in his mind, and he says, "No, I'm not going to take your $5, but at $20 a head, everyone can come see me tomorrow night, and I'll read the whole newspaper out loud from," and he just picked a spot at random. So he was pretty good. I mean, that's pretty good thinking on the spot there. He's pretty good at making money, at turning things in his favor. And Kate fell for him hard. They fell in love. He was clean cut, as you can see there. That's pretty unusual for that time period. Think of all these long bearded miners. Alex kind of struck a figure there, and he would be probably described as tall, dark, and handsome, which, as we all know, works pretty well as a descriptor. And Kate at the time was pretty quickly independently wealthy, and the toast of the whole town. So it was quite a pairing initially, and they spent a really lovely summer together. And it's important at this point in her story to understand the depth of her love for Alex, because it's going to be hard to remember that from his actions later on in life, as some of you that are chuckling are anticipating, I think. Kate was constantly, of course, at this time being asked to marry a variety of men, but Alex was the only one she ever really fell for. And in later years, she wrote a poem about Alex, and I'm going to read that poem to you now. "I follow the trail of memory where the Arctic poppies grow, and I dream you are there beside me, holding my hand as you did long ago. And I hear the huskies howling, it's their song of eventide. There's no other sound just like it, though you search both far and wide. I follow the paths again with you over the northern hills. I walk again down memory lane, and it seems you are there with me still. Peace and contentment fill my heart as the end of the trail draws near, till at last I see the rainbow's end with all of my heart holds dear." But Alex quickly lost his job as a waiter. As you can imagine, perhaps from the newspaper story I told about Alex, he was constantly looking for little side hustles, little ways to make money on the side, never content with just his paycheck as his waiter. So he went a little bit overboard with that and got fired, and then earned a bad reputation for himself and had trouble getting another job. And so he was unemployed, and Kate was meanwhile independently wealthy, so he moved in with Kate, and he eventually convinced her to buy a failed theater in town called the Orpheum, which you can see there. It's the brown building kind of in the middle of the picture, and he convinced her to purchase it with her money and for them to run it as a co-venture. So the Orpheum became a success. Alex had a special gift, or a genius even, at sensing what people wanted and giving it to them, as you'll hear more about later on. That would be enormously valuable for him later on in life. And he booked a wide variety of different vaudeville shows to come through Dawson and perform at the Orpheum Theater. And when they got into full swing, and which was pretty quickly, they grossed an astonishing $8,000 a day, about $229,000 a day in gross ticket sales by today's money. So they were pulling in money left and right. This photograph shows Kate and a friend. Kate is the woman on the right-hand side. And around this time, there's a little bit of a mystery about Kate's life. Around the winter of 1900 to 1901, she acquired a child. So probably it was her own child by Alex, and they were unmarried at the time, but she never openly admitted to that. That's later speculation. She always claimed that while she was in the Klondike, a pregnant girl had been dying from tuberculosis and had asked her to care for her child after it was born. So that's the story Kate always stuck to, and no one really knows what's true about it. But for one way or another, she acquired a child around this time, and she later said about the child, "I kept the baby until he became as dear to me as if he had been my own." She would eventually later place him with foster parents in the States. But she went on to say, Well, he was still too young to remember his birthplace and my profession and me. I sent him to live with foster parents in the States, and I sent money for his college education, and he is today one of the most successful engineers in the country. I've never disclosed his identity, and he perhaps has never known of me, but I like to think of him as my son. So that's something she wrote many years later. There's a couple of tantalizing clues there. She claims that this fellow is one of the most successful engineers in the USA, and sometime around the 1920s or so. So, there's definitely a chain of mysteries there to further explore in the future. But by summer of 1901, Dawson was in decline. The gold rush had moved on toward Nome, Alaska, and Alex was anxious to leave. He wanted to head down to the lower 48 states, and so they did. They took off. They left the Yukon. They arrived in New York City for a while. They were looking for a suitable business venture to go into. Then they left the east for the west. They went to Seattle, and that's where they settled for a little bit. And in spring of 1902, they firmly committed to living in Seattle, where reportedly, Kate left the Klondike with $100,000 in gold coin. So again, that's about $2.3 million by today's standards. And in Seattle, Alex started buying up theaters. And he started this new notion that he got from Kate of combining this new thing called the motion picture show, right? So the burgeoning film industry. He started combining feature films with vaudeville acts. So he was kind of straddling this gap between the 19th century entertainment and what would become the 20th century. And here's a picture of one of his early theaters, and Pantages, I'm sure, is a familiar name to some folks in here because eventually he would own theaters up and down the West Coast, and there's still Pantages theaters today, and there's a famous one in Los Angeles where they've held the Oscars and so on from time to time. But while Alex was going on with his business ventures in Seattle, he sent Kate to Texas to make money, because in Texas there's a whole nother kind of boom going on called black gold or oil. Oil was all the rage at the moment in Texas, and Alex figured he could send Kate down there and she could make a lot of money in the dance halls and little oil boom towns in Texas, and she willingly said yes. She went over to Fort Worth and to Galveston, Texas in the summer of 1903. And she sent the vast majority of her money back to Alex in Seattle to help him fund his growing theatrical empire. And eventually Kate returned to Seattle, where she helped out at one of his theaters called the Crystal Theater. She developed a new dance. This is after her flame dance that had kind of worn out its welcome. She'd done it a lot. So she developed a new dance called the Butterfly Dance. And she started taking bookings for this butterfly dance at various theaters in the Pacific Northwest, including in her hometown of Spokane. And that's where she was surprised, because she was treated as something of a local celebrity. And while she was dancing there in Spokane, one night a friend delivered a fateful letter to her. The letter was from Alex, and he wrote to say that, oh, by the way, I've married a 17-year-old violinist, and you're no longer welcome to return to Seattle. So he'd married a girl named Lois Mendenhall, who was, as I said, 17 years old. She was from a prominent West Coast family, and Alex, again, he always had his eyes on that next level and the next tier, and he was essentially marrying into one of the West Coast prominent California families. So he ditched Kate via a letter through a friend, and Kate took it really hard. She was heartbroken and despondent. She drank really heavily at that point in time in saloons, and she said she kind of went all to pieces. But in one of the darker days of her life, a letter arrived from a good friend of hers that said, "Don't throw your life away because of one man. Don't make yourself something he will always be glad that he was rid of. Instead, make yourself something he will wish he had kept." And that letter really inspired Kate to kind of pull herself together again, to reinvent herself, to start a new life. So embittered but emboldened, she launched a heavily publicized lawsuit against Alex. She filed a $25,000 breach of promise suit in King County, which is a Seattle area in Washington, which made front page headlines in the Seattle Times. And Alex denied having ever been engaged to her, and their whole love affair was sort of drawn out in the tawdry pages of the press. Right at the same time as Alex's businesses were booming. That's actually the former, this is no longer there, but the Pantages Theater in Portland, Oregon, so our closest local representation of his theatrical train. So the theater business was booming, and Kate was growing weary of this lawsuit and growing pretty particularly weary of her personal life being dragged through the presses, so she settled out of court for a $5,000 payment and dismissed her suit. But there's a lot of controversy over how much money that actually was. Some people say it was actually a $60,000 suit. It's kind of a wide range of interpretations of what happened there exactly. But this lawsuit and the press that went with it made Alex here kind of a hated figure by the sourdoughs, by the old miners from Alaska and the Yukon, especially as they left that area and went back into the lower 48. A lot of the miners famously boycotted ever going to a Pantages theater because they hated how she treated their queen, how they treated the queen of the Klondike. So that reputation haunted Alex for the rest of his life. And meanwhile, Kate began a new phase in her life, which I call the broken-hearted wanderer. She started drifting around. She started traveling throughout the Pacific Northwest. She went up to Alaska and came back a couple of times. She briefly owned a hotel in Fairbanks that burned down. And she had the most success actually in this period of time when she teamed up with a fellow named Jimmy Ray, who was a top-notch roller skater. And she learned how to roller skate, and the two won a few national championships, which I guess was an option in that era. She learned how to do some hard falls while doing that, and eventually those hard falls caught on with her. She fell a few too many times while learning how to do this advanced roller skating moves, and eventually she couldn't keep the act going anymore. But people have conjectured that perhaps her and Jimmy Ray, this roller skating champion, were married for a while. No one's ever proven that. It's not no marriage certificates ever surfaced, but whether or not they were married doesn't particularly matter. At that point in time, too, Kate got increasingly reliant on alcohol, and that's something that Alex had pleaded with her to stop in her earlier years. And so kind of depleted from all these falls, from roller skating and from drinking really heavily, she had to quit that act, and she had to eventually return to Seattle, where her mother was still living. And Kate at that point in time was verging on the brink of a nervous breakdown, and a doctor told her, you've got to get away from the kind of life you've been leading, try to forget everything for a year or two. So she did. She had seen at one point in time in one of these little vaudeville houses that were showing films, she'd seen a really early travelogue of Central Oregon. And the movie houses, this is a photo of Central Oregon around that time period, and it inspired her. She longed to come down to Central Oregon and visit the area, and she found the excuse now in her life to do that. In 1910, she bought a 6-shooter and a horse, and I love this part of her life. So with a 6-shooter and a horse, she leaves. Yeah, what else do you need? Thank you. Yes. With those two things, she took off from Seattle and began a long, slow journey down to Central Oregon, living off of some money from that settlement, that breach of suit settlement from Alex. And she stayed along the way in various hotels, or she'd stay at the sites of friendly homesteaders or ranchers. And she just took any kind of side road or cattle trail that drew her fancy and made it a really leisurely journey down this way. Eventually, though, she made it to Bend. She made it here around 1910 when Bend was bursting at its seams with ranchers and mule skinners and wranglers and traders and loggers and railroad gaudy dancers and homesteaders, most famously looking for a place to squat. So cabins were going up all over the high desert at that point in time as homesteaders staked their claim, and that kind of feeling, that kind of energy reminded Kate of Dawson, of a place and time period that she missed, that she'd loved in her life. And she noted that and thought she'd come back to Bend, but her restlessness got the better of her and she continued south for a little while. She went to Crater Lake, where she lingered while a rustic lodge was being built. That rustic lodge, of course, a lot of you have seen today. That's pictured on the left there. And then she moved on to Medford, Oregon, pictured on the right-hand side around that time, over by Ashland there, where she ran a boarding house for a year. But that whole time she wanted to come back to Central Oregon. She wanted to return to Bend and go into business here, but she needed some money first. So she took to the vaudeville acts again. She spent the next 4 years after she closed down her Medford boarding house going up and down the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, performing in vaudeville. And eventually she returned to Seattle for a spell where she worked in vaudeville. And her mother, at that point in time, this is a photo, by the way, of Kate in one of her vaudeville performances. Her mother at the time was operating a real estate office in Seattle. And Kate's Oregon dreams came true one day when someone came into this little real estate office in Seattle and they wanted to swap a homestead claim near Brothers for waterfront property in Seattle. And so Kate was really excited about this. So she was beside herself. She actually said, I'm going to just throw in some cash on top of that to sweeten that deal. She wanted that homestead claim near Brothers. And in 1914, she achieved her dream. She acquired a homestead claim near Brothers, while the other guy got something like this. Kate ended up somewhere like this. So, but this enters the next phase of Kate's life, the Central Oregon homesteader. So Kate packed really quickly, and she departed Seattle in a rush, arrived here in Central Oregon in 1914 again, and she arrived at her homestead. This is a photograph of the land that was under her homestead claim. Her cabin's now gone, but that's the land that she homesteaded out by Brothers, and she was horrified. She'd signed on for this sight unseen. Always a mistake in real estate, right? And it's, as you know, it's about 40 miles east of Bend, and the homestead itself was about 3 further miles north of Brothers. She said, quote, I had about $3,500 in cash and $3,000 in diamonds. And I went to look at the place, and I found I owned a one-room shack in the middle of a 320-acre homestead. I never saw so much country in my life. Sagebrush as far as the eye could see. In ballroom gowns and high heels, I started grubbing sagebrush and piling rock. Several times I was ready to give up, and I guess if it hadn't been for the sheer beauty of the desert sunsets, I'd have quit. I found a new happiness, though, like having my soul cleaned, a perfect contentment and rest for the first time in my life. Money seemed so unimportant. So this actually was a happy time in the end for Kate. There was a lot of get-togethers and dances with the fellow homesteaders. They'd gather together in someone's cabin around a parlor piano, and they'd play songs late into the night. And it's one of those kind of funny things where this part of the world is less populated now than it was then. So every 320 acres or so around Brothers in that era, there was another homestead, another family living. So it's not quite as desolate as it is today. If you drive out into that region, there's quite a few people living out there at the time. And Kate had a really great time. She earned quite a reputation for herself because she never quite let go of her sense of 1890s vaudevillian fashion. She'd always wear elaborate ball gowns and hats anytime she'd go to some homesteader's claim. And they loved her for that. I mean, as people do, they love people with that kind of open personality, right? So she also never missed weekend dances at this place, which has fallen on hard times in the intervening years, but this is still out there in the desert. This is called Pringle Hall, and they used to hold weekly all-night dances here. And apparently at one point in time, Kate had scrawled her name onto one of the walls here, but whether that's true or not remains to be found if anyone wants to pull apart all those wooden beams. But that spot, as well as her cabin, became a hot spot for the local homesteaders in the region. She always had visitors dropping in at all hours, particularly, as you can imagine, single men. And there's a lot of single men trying to homestead in Central Oregon at the time, including the fellow on the right here named Floyd Warner. He was described as dashing and handsome. He was a young wrangler from a ranch nearby to Kate's. There's actually a photograph of Kate, the only one I could ever find of her in her homesteading days. So he was 19 years younger than Kate at the time. So Kate was 39 years old and Floyd was 20 years old, and they eloped. They ran off to Prineville and got married on October 26, 1915. And Kate always described it as one of those spur of the moment and spur of the horse things, which I think is kind of a great description of that. So they lived both on Kate's claim and on Warner's claim in the desert, and they ran a small herd of cattle, and they made hay. And Kate, as befits her character, left frequently, and for undefinable periods of time, she'd just take off and disappear for a while, traveling around the West, San Francisco and Seattle. She always missed, the city life, and she got back there as much as she could. And Floyd certainly thought that she was cheating on him. Probably she was, if we're being honest about it. She never was super committed in that way. But when she was in Central Oregon, she also developed, and you can kind of see these rocks here, she developed a keen interest in rocks of all things. Not what you'd expect from her, but she became Central Oregon's first real rock hound. And she's known by rock hounds today as sort of the first one to notice what was going on geologically in Central Oregon. So once America joined the First World War, her husband Frank left, and he joined up with the Quartermaster's Corps. And in the meantime, Kate received her certificate of ownership for her 320 acres. She received that certificate in 1917, having at least nominally lived at her homestead for the previous 3 years. Of course, she was in and out. And the second she got that, she abandoned her cabin and left for the comparatively urban life of Prineville, Oregon, seen here. In Prineville, she bought of all things, a small convalescent hospital, and she ran that for a time. She gave that up, and she bought the little cafe, the little waffle stand, that little white building in the middle, the only surviving photograph of that instead. And she also, during the First World War, launched herself into efforts to care for the sick during the 1918 flu epidemic, which swept through here as it swept through everywhere. And she would travel into Bend from Prineville to help out with the efforts. In Bend, the Amateur Athletic Club by the downtown Bend Library, it's now the Boys and Girls Club of Central Oregon. That place had been converted into an emergency hospital. It was filled up with cots of people that were sick. There were about 40 cots in the gymnasium there, and they were experiencing almost 4 deaths a night at that spot. And Kate never really was scared of things like that, and she had some nursing experience from running that convalescent home for a spell, and she was employed particularly in helping out with the home cases, which were the older men who were sick with the flu but for whatever reason couldn't be moved. They were too fragile to be moved into the central hospital there. So she was noted for many years as playing quite a role in helping out in the 1918 flu epidemic. And after the war ended, her husband Floyd returned, and they briefly ran that little waffle cafe stand together in Prineville. But their relatively unhappy marriage came to a quick end after his return from the war, and they divorced in 1922. And that launched another period of wandering for Kate. While her money sort of dwindled down, she wandered again all over the West and enters the next phase of her life, the Aunt Kate, or our destitute prostitute phase. Kate was getting older. She couldn't dance like she used to. She'd been drinking heavily a lot throughout her life and so on, and she hadn't really ever developed any employable skills besides singing and dancing and so on, and that's a problem once you start to age, right? So she struggled to survive for a while. She worked in several small cafes, including here in Bend, as a fry cook for low pay. But for one reason or another, and again, Kate's life is shrouded with various mysteries, which is one of the intriguing things I think about her. But she came into money for one reason or another, and she bought a house in Bend at 231 Franklin Street, unfortunately since destroyed, but near the downtown. And this is the photograph of her house on Franklin Street. She acquired a little bit of property along with that house. This is right across the street from the former St. Charles Hospital, for folks that are familiar with Old Bend. And it was a rustic 2-story house with 6 rooms and a few outbuildings. She remodeled it. She added that large front porch, which you probably can't see all that well with the photograph, but it's there. And she finished it in these weathered brown shingles, and it sort of purposely had the appearance of a pioneer homestead or of a Yukon cabin, again reminding her of a happy period in her life. And her home became a Bend landmark for many years, for several decades. Her rock collection from the high desert became that chimney that you can see on the left there. It was turned into a fireplace by various itinerant men that she employed for short periods of time. Here's a photograph of Kate in front of her chimney, and on the other side of that was a large fireplace, and in front of that fireplace she kept a large chair that she called her confessional. And she so frequently had visitors that came to her to talk about their problems and their troubles. She was always on the side of the underdog, on the side of the disenfranchised or the ill or the poverty-stricken. To those sort of folks, her door was always open, and that's one of the reasons her home became a Bend landmark. To make a little bit of money on the side, she also took in boarders and mail roomers at the house as well. And she became a great friend of the Bend Fire Department. Here's another picture of Kate. One cold winter night, she, on a whim seemingly, followed the sirens of the local fire trucks as they went off to fight a fire, and she delivered to the firemen coffee from her jalopy. And this thoughtful gesture was much appreciated by the local firemen. And from that time on, Kate decided she'd be a familiar figure at every fire in Bend. So anytime she heard the sirens day or night, she'd hop into her car and she'd follow the fire truck, and she'd serve coffee and sandwiches to the fellows she affectionately called her boys from her jalopy there. And because of charitable acts like this, she developed one of her nicknames around Bend, which is Aunt Kate. A lot of people felt that she fulfilled that sort of aunt to the community role. So Aunt Kate became one of her nicknames. She also made a shrine for St. Charles Hospital across the street from her house. Even though she wasn't Catholic, it was a good excuse to use up some more of her rocks, as you can see there from the high desert. Unfortunately, that's gone now too. But she'd always felt some affinity for Catholicism. She'd spent a lot of time getting kicked out of Catholic schools, after all. But Kate wasn't Aunt Kate to everyone. Here's a photograph of Bend around that time. There were always people in Bend who didn't quite approve of Kate. Yeah, that's Wall Street. Yep, that's Wall Street in the 1920s. So there's always folks in Bend who didn't quite approve of Kate or of what they thought her life had been. She'd always been, of course, at the minimum unconventional, and you could imaginatively build it from there. She was viewed as a busybody by some people, as an attention seeker, and that her charitable efforts were sometimes written off as just attempts to bring the spotlight back on herself. And there's some small truth in that claim. Kate always loved being in the limelight. She loved the spotlight. She loved anything that got attention. But folks that didn't like Kate called her the destitute prostitute. They liked the rhyme of that, apparently. And of course, that brings up the question of whether Kate actually ever was employed as a prostitute. Some people have always maintained that she was. She certainly never admitted to that, and it remains something of a mystery. It doesn't particularly matter for the course of her life, but some folks in Bend definitely thought she'd earned a living for a while from that, or that she still did that sometimes while living in Bend. And of course, by her own accounts and by the accounts of her friends, she never dabbled in anything like that. But it gets a bit gray there. It's a bit of a mystery. The confusing part comes in from the fact that no one really knows how Kate was earning money during this time period in life. She had a few boarders and so on, but it was never very much capital. And so there's lots of speculation over that, and that's where some of these prostitution rumors come out. There was rumors that she would encourage certain girls to join up with brothels in Portland or Seattle and earn a cut from that. But whether that's just slander or had some truth to it, of course, remains a mystery. My opinion is she probably received payments from Alexander Pantages, the fellow from earlier in our story tonight, who by the 1920s was a household name all over America, an extraordinarily wealthy fellow. That vaudeville theater thing became a huge hit. He was living in Los Angeles at the time, and his new family with that 17-year-old violinist that he'd married, they had about $50 million fortune at the time, which is about $664 million by today's reckoning. They had just killed it. And my theory on Kate's sources of money during this time is that she sort of, in a friendly way perhaps, blackmailed Alex for payments, because I think I feel like that child she acquired in 1900 was probably her own kid by Alex, and if she'd exposed that would have been a huge controversy, and it would have sunk his very popular name. So my opinion is Kate probably lived off of some payments that she got from Alex during that time, but it's all speculation. So Kate, we know, made mysterious trips out of Bend, and she would disappear for different stretches of time, and then she'd reappear at her house on Franklin Street, and no one really knew where she went or what she was up to. I think some of those trips probably found her down in Los Angeles, and I think she probably came back from those trips with a little bit of extra money in her pocket. But then in the fall of 1929, during the middle of the Wall Street crash, Alexander's fortune and reputation all sunk because he was charged with the rape. He was charged with the rape of a 17-year-old girl named Eunice Pringle, and she was an aspiring vaudeville dancer in Los Angeles. She alleged that Alex had attacked her in a small side office of his downtown establishment, of his major downtown Los Angeles theater, and this was a huge deal at the time. This was massive press coverage across the entire nation, front page headlines, leading daily stories with updates. It'd be like one of our major movie stars today being caught up in some kind of rape scandal. And Kate was actually subpoenaed as a witness to testify for the prosecution against Alexander's character. She was called down. First of all, the photograph on the right is Eunice, who had accused Alex of rape, and the photo on the left is of Alex around that time period. So Kate was called down, and her identity was initially revealed by the prosecution team, and there's a lot of speculation in the press, a lot of coverage in the press about who this mystery woman was that the prosecution had called down. And Kate received eventually some heady national attention from this trial. Kate was sort of shocked when she met Alex again. She was shocked by his worn appearance. He clearly was worn down by this whole business. He always maintained that he was innocent of this charge, that he hadn't actually had anything to do with this girl, that it was all a false accusation, that Eunice had been employed by rival theater owners to make this wild accusation about rape against him. So Alex and Kate famously exchanged a few words one day in the hall of the LA court, but what words were spoken is one of the other mysteries of Kate's life. In the end, Kate actually never was called to the stand, and it surprised few anyway that shortly after that, Alex was convicted in court, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison, despite his continual claim that he'd been set up. So eventually, Alex successfully petitioned for an appeal to his case, and 2 years later, he was acquitted. He was let go from prison. That ordeal, however, and the press coverage and everything that went into it, the loss of his fortune and of his family, caused his health to decline to the point where he had a heart attack, and he never recovered and died 5 years later. The press attention, however, turned Kate into the spotlight, and she became something of a celebrity. She started to kind of mine that press coverage for all it was worth. It was a turning point in her life, and it launched the next phase, which I'm calling the romantic celebrity. She made the most of this press attention. She's always good at that, always turning lemons into lemonade, as it were, always finding a way to turn a situation to her favor. So all this is going on, and far away at the same time period, deep in the Yukon, deep in the north, there's an aging sourdough miner, a fellow named Johnny Matson, who you can see on the right there. He never left the north, he never left the Yukon since the Gold Rush days, and we talked a little bit earlier about how newspaper accounts were slow to arrive up there. This was still the case in the 1920s, but eventually a newspaper arrived in the far north that detailed aspects of the Alexander Pantages trial in Los Angeles and talked about Kate being called by the prosecution as a witness. And this fellow, Johnny, remembered Kate from all those years previous when she'd been the queen of the Yukon and she'd been dancing in the far north. And he'd always been in love with her, and he'd given up hope of ever seeing her again. But he got this newspaper and he stewed over it for a couple of weeks and kind of thought, what can I do? So he finally got the gumption to write a letter to Kate. So he wrote her a love letter, and he assumed, okay, she's never going to get this. So he put it in the mail. But she got it. It arrived here at Franklin Street in Bend, and Kate dimly recalled Johnny. She remembered him as a silent, young Swedish fellow who would come religiously each night to see her dance at the Savoy. And he'd always stand in the back, he'd always stand up against the wall, he wouldn't talk to anybody else, and he'd just watch Kate dance every night. She remembered him as being kind and quiet and shy, and she was extremely touched by this letter 30 years later that arrived from this fellow that had always sort of kept the flame alive for Kate. So the two arranged to meet in Vancouver, British Columbia, at a hotel, and that was only the second time that Johnny had been outside of the far north in 35 years, and they quickly got married. Kate was 53 years old, he was 70 years old, and he said to her, "You look just the same to me as you did all those years ago," which is a charming thing to say. And so 2 weeks later they got married in July of 1933. It was supposed to be a quiet wedding, but the press got word of it and it carried it as front page copy. There's one of the newspaper stories that came out of it, became one of the great romantic legends of the Klondike Gold Rush. So Johnny went back to his claim in the far north, and Kate returned to Bend, and every year was I think this is how they made their marriage work. Every year was supposed to be Johnny's last year. It was supposed to be his last year at his claim, and it never was. And instead, every single year, they'd spend 2 weeks together in some West Coast city, Seattle or Vancouver or Portland. And then the rest of the year, they'd inhabit their own respective haunts. And Johnny was always a die-hard prospector, always kind of waiting for that next big strike, always convinced that if he stuck around one more year, it would happen for him, the big strike. It kind of gets in your blood, I think, especially for some personalities. And after so long in the wilderness, he didn't really want to live in any town, even a town as small as Bend was in that era. And Kate, meanwhile, never wanted to live again in such a remote spot. And she actually never even visited Johnny at his cabin deep in the Yukon. So instead, they maintained a lively letter correspondence, and Johnny would send her money for support and for upkeep on her house, and he'd send gifts of gold and jewelry and furs from the north, and they were happy in their way. And Kate said, "If you make one person completely happy, you have not lived in vain. I know I've made my Johnny completely happy, and in doing so, I'm happy myself." So Kate was now a celebrity as well, at least to some extent after all the press from that Pantages trial, and especially after her marriage to Johnny Matson, which the press loved. It was such a great story about this rekindled love after all these years. And she received a major series of articles in the Sunday Oregonian by our own native, Bend native Paul Hosmer, probably a familiar name to some folks here, that brought her celebrity to an all-time high. And she became very happy about this new rush of attention. She purposely developed, she kind of played up this Old West personality well into the 20th century. She always had an 1890s appearance about her, and she intoned her speech in that kind of 1890s way as well. And she got invited to parties constantly, upper class parties and so on, because she was expected to inject a bit of life into it. And she was happy to do that. She was never at a loss for words. She was always rolling her own cigarettes. She was always kicking up her skirts, ready to do a quick little dance. So she'd pop up all over the West Coast at parties and social gatherings in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver and Los Angeles, etc. And she was extremely good at self-promotion at that point. She'd always let newspapers know in advance of her arrival into town and would typically earn herself a profile. Reporters always liked her off-the-cuff remarks, her flair for the dramatic. She made numerous appearances as grand marshals of parades and that kind of thing. And my favorite story about this is she had a special relationship with the Portland, Oregon police. So she would drive her car from Bend to the outskirts of Portland, and then she'd call the police and ask for a police escort into town. So she'd leave her car on the outskirts of Portland. The police who loved her, the policemen of Portland, they'd pick her up, they'd bring her down to her downtown hotel where she'd always stay. And then anytime she wanted a ride to a party or a social function of some sort, she'd just call the police. And they'd show up and escort her there in a squad car, which is, you know, she knew how to make an arrival, right? I mean, that's how you can show up at a place and have them remember you. Meanwhile, she'd always dreamed of selling her story to Hollywood, which did finally happen. In the early 1940s, she was called down to Hollywood to consult on a story about her life with Anne Savage, pictured here, actually, in the lead role in the middle there. So this is actually a scrapbook that was kept by Kate. So these are things that she'd put in there. I haven't physically seen this, unfortunately. It's held up in the Yukon at an archive deep up there, but they sent me some photographs of some of the cool pages from it, and that's what you're looking at here. So Kay went down to Hollywood to consult about this film that was supposed to be about her life, and she soon had a falling out with the producers, and she thought they weren't paying any attention to the authenticity of her story, so she left and she went back to Oregon and kind of wrote the picture out of her life. But it came out anyway. Here's the film here. It was released as a B picture. And Kate said to the press that it was entirely fictional. I don't recognize anything in it that happened to me. We showed this film. I tracked down a DVD copy of it, and we showed it at the museum. And it's true. There's literally nothing in this movie that even remotely resembles Kate's life. It's kind of just a low-grade Western, and they literally just borrowed the name, and that's it. That's the only tie to Kate's life. So she wasn't wrong about that. But you can track down this copy today. We have it at the museum. You can also find it on eBay and so on. So then in the fall of 1945, Kate made her husband, Johnny, promise that he'd have this be his last year in the North, that he'd finally come down, as he was getting pretty old at that point in time, in his mid-70s. And so she wrote to him these letters saying, "You need to come out of the far north," and she never received a response, and she grew increasingly worried. So in spring of 1946, she finally left Bend to go up into the north and see what was going on. And she employed a fellow miner, a fellow sourdough named John Sestak, to mush out into the wilderness and try to figure out what was going on with Johnny and why she hadn't heard from him for a year now. And this fellow Sestak found Johnny dead in his cabin, apparently having died of natural causes, although by the time they found his body, it had been torn apart by wolves, and there was very little left. That's how life and death go in the Klondike and the far north. This is a photograph of somewhere near Johnny's claim there. So the fellow that Kate had employed guided the Canadian Mounties back to the claim, and they arranged for Matson to be buried on the claim itself. What was left of his body was buried out there in the deep outback there. And Kate held on to the claim, held on to Johnny's claim, which of course she inherited for a few years, and she had a headstone put up there in the wilderness. I've never seen a photograph of it. I'm not sure if one exists still or if anyone's ever found it again. But eventually she signed that claim over to the guy that found Johnny's body, over to Sestak, and entered instead into the final phase of her life, her quiet retirement. So Kate said after Johnny's death, she's always one to kind of bounce back pretty quickly from trouble. She said, I guess I'll just mush on and smile. And mush on and smile became a trademark quote from Kate, something that she'd put on photographs that she'd sign to people that wanted her signature. And she did that. She mushed on and smiled. And 2 years later, in 1948, she married this fellow, seen here in the picture. This guy is named Bill Van Duren, a longtime friend of Kate's, a longtime Bend resident, and a lodger for a period of time at her house on Franklin Street. He was a retired accountant. He had a terrible eye problem, and Kate had actually funded his eye surgery at one point. And anyway, the two married in Vancouver, Washington, so right across from Portland there, by a judge after asking for a waiver of the usual 3-day waiting period required before you can actually get married. Time is of the essence, said Bill. And Kate added, I was the flower of the north, but the petals are falling awfully fast, honey. So they said, okay, go ahead and get married. And about 200 people came to the wedding. They descended on the Clark County Courthouse to see Kate, quote, do it again. So Vancouver merchants gave them a hearty reception, and champagne toasts were held around the city. And it was actually a happy marriage, the happiest marriage of her life. They had known each other for a long time, and they had always been good friends. And as we all know, friendship's a great reason to be married to somebody. So eventually, though, they left Bend for Sweet Home on the other side of the Cascades. And Kate would continue to make appearances in public whenever she could. She did frequent interviews, and she was active in various reunions for the miners, for the sourdoughs from the far north. They would hold these big get-togethers every year in various West Coast cities. And Kate and her husband also made frequent trips back across the mountains to the high desert, to here, to the place where she'd homesteaded in the old days, the place that she'd always felt most at peace. And they'd head out here when her cabin was still standing, and they'd build a fire of sagebrush, and they'd heat up some coffee, and they'd watch the desert sunsets together. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing. So then on February 21st of 1957, Kate died at age 80. She died quietly in her sleep at her house over in Sweet Home, Oregon. And her passing was noted in lots of newspapers around the country. It was described as the closing of an age, sort of the closing of this great gold rush age in American history. Mentioned in Time magazine and Newsweek magazine. And Kate had told her friends and her husband that she wanted her ashes scattered on the high desert by her homestead that she'd loved so well. And Bill, her husband, had intended to do this, but instead he had entered into a period of declining health himself, and was forced to retreat to Washington State to live with a son from a previous marriage. And so Kate's ashes actually lingered for years in a mortuary in Salem. And finally in 1960, and this is one of the other mysteries of Kate's life, in 1960 a stranger came by the mortuary in Salem and signed off on the release for the ashes, having heard through one channel or another about Kate's final request to have her ashes scattered in the high desert. So he traveled out to Bend. He went past Bend and out into the desert himself, and he took Kate's ashes out there and scattered them across her homestead on an overcast day when snow was falling on the ridges. So her final wish was finally met several years later. Kate's house today, unfortunately, is an office building here on Franklin Street, a building that some of you might be familiar with. It's where Superior Property Management houses their business. It's called informally Kate's Place. There's a little sign in front, and you can see the office building in the lower right. The photograph in the upper right was the last photograph taken, and that was from the Bend Bulletin right on the eve of the destruction of the house. It had fallen into a great state of disrepair, and it's kind of before our current interest in historic preservations is right at the cusp of that in the, as you can imagine, in the late 70s and early 80s. And they actually offered the house for free to anyone that was willing to move it And they kept that offer open for a year, and no one took them up on it. And so in the end, it was bulldozed and demolished, unfortunately. And now we have a relatively ugly office building there instead. But so it goes. So another lingering aspect of Kate and Ben are these stumps that probably some of you have walked past before, not knowing what you're walking past in Drake Park. So Kate, while she was living on her homestead at one point in time, discovered these petrified stumps. A high wind blew across the desert one day and uncovered these ancient tree stumps. And she always had been intrigued by geological history, by rocks and petrified anything. And so eventually she asked her friends at the fire hall, the Bend firemen, to move these stumps into town. They installed them for a while at Kate's house, and then eventually they moved them into Drake Park, where they are sitting in cement to this day and have no sign anywhere near them. So no one knows what they are. So we're working on that. We hope to eventually get a sign installed so people know what these petrified stumps are and how they connect to Kate and to our own local history. So in closing tonight, I'll leave you with this photograph and then one of Kate's poems that she wrote about herself that kind of summarizes her philosophy at the end of her life. And all that I can leave you are memories of the past, the dreams we dreamed together that were too sweet to last. To the tired and weary-hearted, burdened down by all life's ills, I'll leave the sunrise on the desert and the twilight on the hills. To the lonely and old folks, many walks down memory lane, hand in hand, like childhood sweethearts, may we wander once again. To the boys and girls who told me when their foolish feet had strayed, I can leave at least the knowledge that they were never betrayed. To the ones who bandied gossip, tore my heart with two-edged words, I leave my full forgiveness to combat the bitter words. And to the friends who were so faithful through my laughter and my tears, I leave peace and contentness for their declining years. So mush on and smile, everyone, and thanks for coming out tonight.